Hey, what's up guys? Gonz here for the Face Like the Sun YouTube channel. I was driving my daughter to school and I just had the radio on. I don't normally listen to the radio a whole lot, but I was listening to a local station, the Bill Handel show on AM640, and nothing too special about the show, but one of the guests that was on was Annie Jacobson, the author of The Pentagon's Brain, an uncensored history of DARPA, America's top secret military research agency. And we talk about DARPA a lot in the film Inhuman and what they're doing, and Annie Jacobson seems to be confirming, at least publicly, some of the things that we talked about in Inhuman. And actually, just an update on Inhuman, I'm working on the audio. The audio mixing is just kind of weird in the film, and I'm trying to get that finished so that it is complete. And just for clarity's sake, I don't think I will be able to publish Inhuman in its entirety on my YouTube channel, just because it's part of Tom Horn and Skywatch TV and their production. And, I was just hired on to do the editing, but hopefully I'll talk to Tom and maybe I can show clips of it here and there. But I don't think I can show the entire thing on YouTube, at least not initially. So that's that. But in any case, the film is being done, but I wanted to play for you just what I recorded on my phone. It's not good quality. You can hear me driving. I think I cough like once or twice in the thing. So bear with me, but I think it was really interesting that this was blasted out into LA, the greater LA area. A lot of people listen to Bill Handel, and they have a pretty big audience in terms of iHeartRadio and just the local AM stations here, talk radio. And one of the things that came out, Annie Jacobson mentioned the word transhumanism. And that to me was pretty spectacular, considering the fact that we are in a time now when it is becoming public information. All this stuff is public. So in any case, here's the interview that I caught on my cell phone. Again, really, really poor quality. I apologize for that, but you can get the basic idea of what they're talking about here. So here it is.
Is that fair to say?
DARPA likes to say where science fiction becomes science fact.
And it is. And just to let you know, my personal connection with DARPA, my partner, Karen, her husband is a rocket scientist at JPL. I mean, for real. He runs a whole group of scientists at JPL. And he has dealt with DARPA for so many years because DARPA has many connections with JPL. Again, the crazy stuff that JPL does usually is on a contract from DARPA. So let's talk about the history, what it does, and just how terrific DARPA is.
Well, DARPA was actually NASA before NASA existed. For about a year, DARPA, then called ARPA, was in charge of all the space equipment that was up there. It was created specifically after the Russians beat us into space with Sputnik, and it was just an enormous amount of money thrown at this agency that would prevent technological surprise from ever happening again.
So, going from preventing technological advances from catching up with us, to let's figure out new ways of doing anything, radar, transportation, robotics, air, space, all of that. When does that transfer into affirmatively developing new kinds of technology?
Right from the get-go. I mean, that was the job right out of the gate, because we couldn't let that happen again where we got beaten. And what's fascinating is it hasn't, but you mentioned all those amazing industries. Think also about biotechnology, that's DARPA. Sensor technology, that's DARPA. DARPA put up the first satellites. The list goes on. And now we're moving into this incredible arena of what's called military transhumanism, where DARPA's looking inside the body to create super soldiers, and that will eventually make its way into the civilian population.
How about freeze-dried ice cream? I remember I go to the museum, and you buy those packets of freeze-dried ice cream, and that's just the neatest stuff in the world. Did DARPA do that?
Sometimes I wonder, they probably did, but it must be still classified.
Got it. So let's talk about the technology. Well, first of all, in general, let's do the nuts and bolts, right? And I am thinking in terms of Larry, my partner's husband. And I said, so how does this work? And tell me where I'm sitting on this. And that is, someone comes up with a completely crazy-ass scheme or concept, and then goes to DARPA and says, I'd like money to research this. And it can get pretty far out. When does DARPA say yes or no to this, under what the rules are?
I think as far out as it can be. DARPA's as interested as it can be. And I think that there's often, yes, scientists go to DARPA, but DARPA is also creating things that people can't even think about and then approaching people who might be involved in it. I'll give you an example. Down at UC Irvine, there's two scientists, David Gardner and Sue Bryant. They're working on limb regeneration. They believe maybe 25 years out, humans will be able to regrow their limbs, just like salamanders can regrow their tails. And who on earth is going to fund this except for DARPA?
And so how does that work? They ask for a grant, and DARPA gives them X number of dollars. What kind of money are we talking about that DARPA hands out?
Well, that grant was $5 million.
See, that's unbelievable. And that's for the Let's Look Like a Salamander grant?
Let's grow a new arm in 25 years. But, this is incredible research. Think about it. It's like soldiers come home without limbs.
Sure.
That's one purpose. But, people lose limbs in accidents. But again, this is like way out. They call it blue sky research or pre-requirement research.
So is that the only organization that does that? I mean, I'm certain it's the only organization in the United States, but worldwide, are there other governments getting involved in that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, for example, Russia has a DARPA, and their defense minister has even said in a few public statements like, our DARPA is better than their DARPA. China has a DARPA, but they don't even talk about it. We actually have a CIA DARPA now. It's called IARPA.
That's fantastic. So typically, let's go through some of the things that DARPA is involved with and some of the history where I could say, wow, DARPA was involved in that, and what are they working on right now? So let's go historically from the early days. What do we give credit to DARPA for helping us to create or create it on its own?
I mean, just about anything you can think of. Okay, so Internet started off as the ARPANET. 1962 begins at the Pentagon. GPS technology. Most people think of that as being 10 years old. DARPA was putting satellites up in the sky for GPS technology in the late 50s. All sensor technology. When you get in your car and it begins to rain and your windshield wipers just go on. That's DARPA. Along with audio sensors, visual sensors, magnetics, every kind of sensor you can think about, DARPA. And that all started in the Vietnam War, believe it or not, when the brilliant idea was to try and listen in of the jungle fighters on the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
That's astounding. It's one of those things that we don't understand how connected. I did an interview with a woman who talked about how the entire food industry is all created out of the Army research, where everything we eat, all the processing, all came out of just the government funding this. How much money are we talking about that DARPA hands out?
DARPA's budget this year is $3 billion. That's just its public budget, so imagine what the black budget must be.
All right, when I come back, I'm going to start exploring that in just a moment. Annie Jacobson, who wrote The Pentagon's Brain, an uncensored history of DARPA, America's top secret military research agency. It's not that top secret, though, is it?
Everything is top secret until you know about it. Then It's not top secret.
We'll be right back. This is KFI AM640. AM640, Bill Handel here. Annie Jacobson, who wrote The Pentagon's Brain. It's the history of DARPA. You may have not heard that, but it's a hugely important governmental agency. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. And what it does is hands out money, grants to people, to organizations, to corporations, to researchers, to scientists. My friend who works at JPL gets money from DARPA. Does DARPA do any of its own research at all, Annie?
Not in its own building. I mean, DARPA, you talked about your friends who have those contracts. So that big budget we were talking about, $3 billion, and by the way, that's been essentially the budget every year since 1958, adjusted for inflation. 120 program managers on average only are responsible for that money. So divide that by $3 billion and think about how much money each program manager, usually himself an excellent top Superman scientist, has to then dole out that money to university laboratories, military laboratories, private industry. Look, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter just went out to Silicon Valley and created 100 new partnerships.
So what kind of thing typically would happen? Give me a typical example of a scientist or a group of scientists or a university coming up with, and then give me the name of some idea, some project, and how it works mechanically.
Well, think about the sensor technology, okay? I see everything as having a much longer progression. In other words, science builds. Science comes out of science. So the short version of, let's say, a sensor is that way back in early days, sensor technology, seismic sensors, for example, like how something registers on the ground, originally set up to try to detect unauthorized nuclear tests. This is back in the 50s when we were watching the Soviets. Then that morphs. So the company that's doing that is Sandia, the weapons laboratory. And then when there's a need for sensor technology in Vietnam, then Sandia is generally called upon. And then that's a top secret contract, or at least a secret contract at the time.
So this is DARPA going to private company and saying, this is what we have in mind. Can you come up with it?
Absolutely.
But it works the other way too, right?
It does, but DARPA puts out alerts, essentially, for grants, and then everybody rushes to it because everyone knows that's where the money is. And by the way, I interviewed 75 scientists for the book. They all love DARPA. I mean, they talk about how DARPA challenges them. DARPA makes them do their best. DARPA gives them money to do things no one else would. So there's this real hand-in-glove relationship between scientists and military science.
Who actually ends up owning the technology? The companies themselves?
Part and parcel. So DARPA takes a lot of it, like those limb regeneration laboratory I was telling you about. A lot of the data goes to DARPA. Some of the data the scientists can make public and write papers on. But that's where you get into this area where you don't know what you know.
All right, so let's talk about sensors. Sensors are going to be every place, and there's not going to be anything we buy doesn't have a sensor in it. And huge monies are going to be made by the people that own the patents, that manufacture. Does DARPA own any of that, or they just give the money and say, here you go, company X, it's yours once you develop it?
The laboratory tends to own most of the patents. Like, for example, on that technology, that becomes Sandia technology. And but then it goes out into industry, and other people are piggybacking.
Yeah, but industry pays for that.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
Who ends up getting the money? The government doesn't own any part of it then, is what you're saying?
Well, the government owns, certainly the secret stuff the government owns. The government has proprietary, research.
But that's not sold in the open market.
Not that I know of. But then you're getting into an area where there's a real competition for that ownership, be it intellectual property or actually the hardware.
What kind of crazy stuff going on right now that you know of? What projects?
The stuff that I found the craziest has to do with what DARPA calls Neuro Prosthetics and what most people would call brain chips. So there's these wounded warriors coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan with brain, injuries. And DARPA has programs where they're putting brain chips, in essence, in the soft tissue of the brain to try and repair and restore cognitive functioning.
Oh, the conspiracy people would go ape on this one.
Well, I'll tell you something. I mean, I interviewed the founder of the Jacobsen scientists, talk about the conspiracy theorists going ape. But these guys are real serious scientists. They've been advising DARPA and the Pentagon for decades. Even the Jacobsen scientists warned this was a really bad idea. Why? And I quote, it could lead to high-quality brain control.
And it really could.
It really could.
Because if you have the ability to, for example, genetic engineering, if you have the ability to cure diseases by manipulating genes, you can manipulate genes.
Absolutely. And DARPA is also in the business of creating cyborgs now. They call them biohybrids, merging animal and machine. So they have two of their flagship programs, which are on the spooky side, unless you don't think they're on the spooky side. They've got a rat with electrodes in its brain that they can steer through a maze, and they've got a moth that they put electrodes into in its pupa stage, turns into a moth. Now the DARPA scientists can fly that moth.
Wow. That's
dystopia.
Are you dystopia?
No, it sounds dystopian, doesn't it?
I don't even know what that word is.
Well, way off in the future, apocalyptic sci-fi.
Okay, I'm going to use that word, and I'm going to take the credit for it, Annie. Thank you very much. Does any of this stuff frighten you? Or when you got involved and you're looking at this because you're interested, at some point did you go, whoa, I'm really uncomfortable with a lot of this?
The artificial intelligence and the brain chips in the brain disturb me because here's why. And by the way, this is like dogma at the Pentagon now, moving toward this, autonomous hunter-killer robots that are artificially intelligent. We're not there yet, but they're moving there. And what bothered me was that there were a lot of generals at the Pentagon, commanding officers and drone operators that were interviewed by the program managers, and they all think it's a really bad idea. But the Pentagon is moving forward anyway.
So I'm assuming that some head honcho at the Pentagon went to see the original RoboCop, the movie, and said, I want one of those. Well, and it started there?
Absolutely. Well, think about this. DARPA is in the business of creating what the military calls revolutions in military affairs. Okay? It's not a revolution if you're not taking someone by surprise.
It's wild. Annie Jacobson, the book, The Pentagon's Brain. Fascinating stuff. And unfortunately, it is not science fiction, or fortunately, it is not science fiction. This is real stuff. The Pentagon's Brain by Annie Jacobson, spelled just the way you would think, Jacobsen. The Pentagon's Brain. Annie, thank you. Fascinating stuff. What are you working on now after this crazy stuff?
Top secret.
Of course it is.
So there you have it. That's Annie Jacobson on the Bill Handel Show. Doing some digging to see if we can get her on Canary Cry Radio to talk about some of the stuff that she discovered and she wrote about with DARPA. And again, this is really interesting because, now there's people out there that are talking about transhumanism and where technology is headed and what DARPA is planning to do with their technology and with their grants and money and all this stuff. And it's kind of confirming a lot of what we've been talking about for years now. So, it's just really interesting that this is all happening. And the most important thing, and the reason why we've been talking about it, and I talk about this on my channel when I can, and I made a whole documentary about the topic of transhumanism, is because the church doesn't have an answer. The church is completely blind to this topic. They go to the movies, they see movies like The Age of Ultron and all this stuff, and they get bombarded with this technology, with, the movies like Transcendence and others, all kinds of stuff, RoboCop or whatever, and I think in their minds they have sort of a cognitive dissonance between their Christianity and what the culture is headed towards, when really there is a synthesis through biblical prophecy and what the Bible told us will happen prophetically. And all that stuff is pretty cutting edge and whatnot, but more and more people are talking about it. It's nothing new for the community of conspiracy theorists and people that have looked at the fringe. But as this information goes mainstream, we have to be there for the people that may freak out and go, wait a minute, how is this right? How is this moral? How does this affect my biblical worldview? If not just my worldview in general. I think atheists will even look at this and say, I don't know about some of this stuff. And so it appeals to their natural ethics and morals. So in any case, that's what I wanted to talk about today. We'll try to get Annie Jacobson on at some point, somewhere, somehow. But that's it, guys. Hope you guys have an awesome day. God bless.